Adrian Volkov had one rule. It was not written anywhere. It was not spoken aloud. But every person in his circle understood it the way they understood gravity, instinctively, and without needing proof. Never trust a woman. He had built his entire empire on that rule. Every wall, every contract, every cold silence across a dinner table. He had kept himself alive with it for 10 years. Then a maid he had never once looked at took a bullet meant for his mother. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate. She just moved, a blur of black and white, and the bullet meant for the most important person in Adrian Volkov's life hit her instead. She hit the marble floor and kept her hand locked around his mother's wrist, even as she lost consciousness. Adrian stood with his gun drawn and his hand completely still. He had survived 17 assassination attempts. He had buried enemies and allies alike without flinching. But he could not move. The most feared man in Eastern Europe had just been protected by the most invisible woman in the room. And somewhere behind him, the person who ordered the shot was already composing his face back into an expression of horror. The Marchetti Grand Hotel's ballroom existed for one purpose: to remind everyone inside it exactly where they stood in the order of the world. Gold chandeliers, bespoke tuxedos, the soft violence of old money pressing against new ambition at every corner of the room. Adrian Volkov stood at the center of it, shaking hands with men he despised, signing the invisible contracts that would finalize his transition out of the underworld and into untouchable legitimacy. The Voss-Kepler merger, 5 years in the making, would close tonight. One signature away from a clean name. He looked like a king. He felt like a man standing on glass. His eyes kept drifting to the far window. His mother, Margaret, sat by the velvet drapes in a deep green gown, her back straight, her hands folded. At 73, she still looked like she owned every room she entered. But tonight she was alone, and the isolation made her look smaller than she was. Adrian had stationed 2 men near her. He told himself it was enough. Across the room, Isabella Crane moved through the crowd like a current beneath still water. Present, necessary, entirely unseen. Her feet ached. The heels the catering company issued were one size too small, and she had been on shift for 6 hours. Her silver tray of champagne flutes felt like it was made of iron. She adjusted her grip and kept moving. She needed this money. Not wanted. Needed. Her sister Lucia had 3 weeks before the landlord, a soft-spoken, dangerous man named Gregor, who collected rent the way others collected debts, made good on his threat. The eviction notice was already printed. Lucia had a 7-month-old daughter. Isabella had one plan: work until her hands gave out. She paused near a marble pillar to reset her posture and breathe through the ache in her feet. That was when she saw him. A man near the east corridor. Tall, expensive suit that didn't quite fit. Bought for the occasion rather than worn for a life. He was standing at the edge of the crowd with a glass of champagne he hadn't touched once in the 40 minutes she'd been moving through the room. Isabella noticed the untouched glass because she was the one who had given it to him. His eyes were not on the string quartet. They were not on the politicians or the socialites or the buffet table. They were fixed, with the patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly the right moment, on Margaret Volkov sitting alone by the window. Isabella's breath caught. She looked toward Adrian. He was deep in conversation with a silver-haired man holding a leather portfolio. His back was to the window. She looked back at the man near the corridor. He shifted his weight. His right hand moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket. Isabella didn't stop to think about Lucia. She didn't stop to think about the rent or the baby or the eviction notice. She set her tray down on the nearest surface and began to move. She was too far away. The realization hit her mid-stride. The crowd was too dense, the room too large, and the man's hand was already inside his jacket. Isabella did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed the edge of a serving cart as she passed it and shoved it, hard, directly into the center of the room. It struck a waiter, who stumbled into a guest, who knocked over a champagne tower. The crash was enormous. Metal, glass, liquid, noise, a small explosion in the center of a silk and gold room. Every head in the ballroom turned. The gunman flinched. His aim shifted toward the sound. His eyes found Isabella, the only person in the room moving toward him instead of away. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The sound swallowed the room whole. Isabella felt the impact before she understood it. A sledgehammer of heat and force through her chest and shoulder, spinning her sideways. Her legs gave way, but her body had already committed to the direction it was moving, toward Margaret, and the momentum carried her forward even as she fell. She hit the floor beside the old woman, her arm swinging out by instinct, her hand finding Margaret's thin wrist and closing around it. Margaret screamed. The crowd broke apart like a wave. Adrian spun. His pistol was in his hand before the echo of the shot had finished. His eyes swept the room for the threat, trained, precise, lethal. They found the floor. The shooter was already gone, slipping through the service corridor while the crowd dissolved into chaos. Adrian didn't chase him. He couldn't move. Isabella lay in a bloom of broken glass and red wine soaking into white linen. The stain spreading across her uniform was darker than the wine. She was not unconscious yet. Her eyes were open, half-focused, aimed somewhere Adrian couldn't see. But her hand was still locked around his mother's wrist with a grip that hadn't loosened, that had not considered loosening, that seemed to operate on a completely different instruction than the rest of her failing body. She was still protecting her. Adrian had spent his entire adult life in rooms where people wanted something from him. He had never once watched someone give something away with no transaction attached. The shot hadn't been random. The trajectory, the timing, the way the security distraction at the entrance had pulled his men exactly 3 seconds before the shooter moved. This was planned. This was surgical. Someone in this room knew exactly where his mother would be sitting. The medics arrived, pushing through the crowd with a stretcher. As they lifted Isabella, her grip finally, slowly released. Adrian crouched down as they moved her. He didn't know her name. He had not learned her name in the 6 hours she had been moving invisibly through this room. "Stay with me," he said, his voice low, like a command aimed at himself. She didn't hear him. She was already gone behind the tide of unconsciousness. The private clinic was the quietest place Adrian knew how to reach quickly. He had paid for the building's discretion 3 years ago, a standing arrangement. The surgeons were the best the city had. They did not ask questions. Adrian stood in the hallway with Isabella's blood drying on the cuffs of his jacket. He had not washed it off. Margaret was safe in the penthouse above. Victor, his most trusted lieutenant, stood beside him, speaking in a measured, careful tone. "The guest list was sealed," Victor said. 47 names. "The table placements were confirmed at 3 this afternoon. Only 4 people in our circle had access to both." Adrian stared at the wall. The memory came without invitation, the way it always did when the world cracked open. 10 years ago, a different gala, a woman named Elena who had laughed at his jokes and called him brilliant and passed his father's location to the Cavern family on a Thursday morning. The ambush left 3 men dead. His father was among them. Adrian had walked out of the smoke with a clean, permanent understanding of how the world worked. Sentiment was a map that led enemies directly to you. Softness was the door you left unlocked. The only people who showed you extraordinary kindness were the ones who needed something extraordinary in return. He had built his empire on that truth. He had never once questioned it, until a catering maid threw her body between a bullet and his mother and hit the floor still holding on. She had nothing. He had checked. Victor had run her file in the car. Isabella Crane. 26. No savings. Medical debt. A sister and an infant niece on the edge of eviction. She was working a catering shift for money she needed by Friday. She had everything to lose, and she had given it without negotiating. "Who are the 4? Adrian asked. Victor handed him a folded paper. Adrian opened it. He read the 4 names once, then again. He folded it back and tucked it in his breast pocket. "Tell no one," Adrian said quietly. "Not yet." He walked past Victor down the hall. He pushed open the door to Isabella's room. She was small against the white sheets, wrapped in the particular stillness of someone the doctors have pulled back from a threshold. The monitors beeped steadily. The room smelled of antiseptic and forced calm. Adrian pulled the chair from the corner to the side of the bed. He sat down. He did not know why he stayed. He told himself it was because he needed answers when she woke. He told himself it was strategic. He sat there until the room turned gray with morning, and he had not moved once. The light was wrong. Isabella's eyes opened to a ceiling that was too high and too clean. The sheets beneath her were the expensive kind, the kind that had a thread count instead of a brand name. Her shoulder was wrapped tightly, and the pain was deep and rhythmic, like a slow drumbeat behind her collarbone. She remembered the sound of the crash, the heat. She turned her head. A man was sitting in the chair beside her bed. His jacket was folded over his knee. His cuffs were stained dark. He was watching her with the unblinking patience of someone who had been sitting there for a very long time. She recognized him instantly. Adrian Volkov. She didn't feel gratitude. She felt her stomach drop. She reached for the 4-line in her arm. Her fingers were shaking, but she pulled the tape away with purpose. "What are you doing?" His voice was low, the kind that filled a room without raising itself. "I have to go," Isabella said. She swung her legs off the bed. The room tilted hard to the left. She held on. "You were shot 12 hours ago. You have a fractured clavicle, and you lost." "I lost my shift," Isabella said, her voice cutting through his. She finally looked directly at him. "My employer will have already filled my slot. If I don't call by 8, they'll dock the full night from my record. I can't afford a missed mark on my file right now." She reached for her shoes. "Where are my shoes?" Adrian stared at her. He had sat at the bedsides of lieutenants who wept from lesser injuries. He had watched men beg for reassurance, for gratitude, for acknowledgement. He had anticipated all of those things from this woman. He had prepared for the transaction, the reward request, the leverage play, the careful angling of someone who had done something significant and knew it. He had not prepared for this. "I'll handle the shift," he said. "I don't need you to handle anything," Isabella replied, still looking for her shoes. "I'll clear your debts," he said. "Your sister's rent. All of it. Come to the estate. Work as my mother's companion." Isabella stopped moving. She looked at him slowly. Then she laughed, a short, dry sound with no warmth in it. "No, you took a bullet for her. Which means I've more than earned the right to never see that world again," Isabella said. The fire in her voice was real, but it was changing, moving from anger into something colder and more deliberate. "Your world has a target on everyone inside it. I'm a maid. I clean things. I go home. I don't sign my life over to men with enemies." She glanced toward the door. Then, despite herself, she thought of Margaret, the way the old woman had looked alone at that table. The particular loneliness of someone surrounded by luxury and protected by strangers who didn't actually see her. "She's a kind woman," Isabella said quietly. "She's the only person I've never been able to protect," Adrian said. The words came out before he had decided to say them. He looked faintly surprised by himself. Isabella watched his face for a moment. She saw something she hadn't expected there, not vulnerability exactly, but the shape of it. The outline of a man who had spent years fortifying himself against something and was not entirely sure it had worked. "Fine," she said. "For her. Not for you. And I need to be able to visit Lucia every week." "Done. And if I decide to leave, I leave. No negotiation." "Agreed." She looked at him for a long moment. "Who wants to kill a woman like Margaret?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Someone who wants to hurt me through her." Isabella held his gaze. "Then they'll try again." He didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. She was right, and they both knew it. The Volkov estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, like a secret the landscape was keeping. To Isabella, it was beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. Margaret was the reason she stayed. The old woman was sharper than her appearance suggested, quick with a dry observation, unexpectedly funny, and possessed of the particular warmth of someone who had lived through enough hardness to recognize kindness as the rarer currency. She didn't treat Isabella like staff. She treated her like the first real company she'd had in years. They fell into a rhythm. Morning tea in the library. Afternoon walks through the rose garden when Margaret's knees allowed it. Reading poetry aloud on rainy days, Margaret reciting from memory, Isabella following along in the book, discovering lines that felt like they'd been written about something she hadn't yet experienced, but was beginning to recognize. Adrian watched. He told himself it was surveillance. It wasn't. He found himself finishing meetings early. He found himself walking through the East Wing on routes that took him past the library windows. He told himself he was monitoring for security gaps. He noticed, with the same precision he applied to everything, that Isabella never asked for anything, never positioned herself, never performed. She just showed up, every day, and cared genuinely for a woman who had been lonely inside a fortress. It unsettled him in a way he could not categorize. Then there was Dominic. Dominic Serov had been at Adrian's side for 22 years. He had the easy manner of a man who understood power well enough to always appear just beneath it. He was the kind of presence that rooms organized themselves around without anyone intending it, affable, trusted, always there. Isabella noticed him the way she noticed the man at the gala. Not because he was loud, because he was too still. She saw the way his eyes moved across the room whenever Adrian left it. The small, satisfied pause after certain conversations. The way he spoke to the household staff, always gently, always with a slight question at the end that managed to sound like concern but functioned like inventory. He was counting things. She didn't know what yet. The rumors began 3 weeks after she arrived. A kitchen maid mentioned that a gardener had seen Isabella taking photographs near the east perimeter. A security guard quietly told Victor he'd seen Isabella on the phone late at night, speaking a language he didn't recognize. None of it was true. Isabella spoke exactly one language, and her phone showed nothing but texts to Lucia about the baby's sleep schedule. But she noticed the rumors the way she had noticed Gregor's eviction notices, arriving too regularly, too precisely timed, originating from a source that wanted to appear neutral. She said nothing. She kept her head down. She visited Lucia on Wednesday. The baby was learning to hold her own head up. Lucia hugged Isabella carefully around the bandaged shoulder and cried a little. Isabella held on longer than she meant to. On the drive back to the estate, she thought about the 4 people who had known Margaret's table placement. She thought about Dominic's eyes when Adrian left a room. She thought, I know what a man who wants something looks like. And that man wants the whole house. She said nothing. Not yet. She had no proof and no power, and the wrong kind of certainty gets people killed. What she didn't know was that Dominic had already decided she was getting too close to the truth. That evening, Adrian summoned her to the study. She walked in to find Dominic already there, standing slightly behind Adrian's chair, his expression arranged into something that looked exactly like reluctant concern. Adrian slid a photograph across the desk. The image showed Isabella at a small cafe table across from a man. The man's name, as Victor's research had confirmed, was Petrov, a mid-level fixer with documented ties to the Vane Syndicate, the primary rival family that had been quietly trying to dismantle Adrian's operations for 3 years. Dominic spoke first. His voice was careful, almost mournful. I didn't want to bring this to you, Dominic said. But Victor confirmed the ID this morning. She's been in contact with Vane's people since her 2nd week here. Isabella looked at the photograph. She looked at Dominic. She looked at the expression on his face, the precise calibration of a man performing regret. She understood everything in that moment. Not the full depth of it, not yet, but enough. She reached into her pocket and placed her phone on the desk. Petrov is my sister's landlord, she said. Her voice was steady. He has been threatening to evict Lucia for 4 months. I met with him to negotiate an extension on her lease. Check the dates. Check the messages. Adrian looked at the phone. He scrolled without a word. The thread was exactly what she described. Timestamps, addresses, Lucia's name, the specific amount of the overdue rent. He read every line. Then he looked at Dominic. The room went very quiet. Adrian was a man who had survived by reading the space between what people said and what their bodies were doing underneath it. He had been doing it since he was 19 years old and had to know whether the man across a table was going to sign a contract or pull a gun. He looked at Dominic and saw a man who had moved too quickly to bring the photograph, who had done the research a full day before reporting it, who was standing slightly too still, with slightly too much control over his own face. He saw a man who already knew the photo was innocent and brought it anyway. 10 years ago, the ambush that killed his father, the insider who had provided the location, the investigation that had gone cold, the name that had never surfaced because the person who ran the investigation had been standing close enough to control what it found. Adrian went completely still. It wasn't a woman who betrayed me. It was the man I trusted to find out who did. 22 years. Every wall he had built. Every person he had kept at a distance. Every rule he had lived by. All of it had been protecting the wrong thing. All of it had been a door he held shut on the wrong side. He dismissed Isabella with a quiet word. She left without asking questions. In the darkened hallway outside the study, she heard Dominic's footsteps follow a minute later. She pressed herself into the shadow of the doorframe. He was on his phone. "Change of plans," Dominic said softly. "She's too close to it. She'll connect the rest on her own." A pause. "Handle the maid before morning. Don't wake the house." Isabella pressed her back against the wall and waited until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Then she went to find the servants' passage she had discovered while doing laundry her third week at the estate, the narrow corridor behind the east wing walls that the original architects had built for discretion and the current occupants had long forgotten. She had not known then why she memorized it. She knew now. 2 hours past midnight the estate held its breath. Isabella had not slept. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark with her shoes on, listening to the house. The floorboard in the east corridor creaked at 2:17 a.m. It was a particular creak, lower and longer than the settling of old wood, caused by weight being distributed carefully. She had spent 6 weeks learning the difference. She moved before she thought. Margaret's room first. She woke the old woman with a hand placed gently over her mouth and a look that Margaret, sharp, perceptive, a woman who had lived inside a dangerous world long enough to read its signals, understood immediately. She didn't make a sound. She gripped Isabella's arm and let herself be led. The servants' passage was narrow and cold. Isabella settled Margaret into the locked linen room at its end, moved a heavy cedar trunk in front of the door, and pressed her hands against the old woman's cheeks. "Stay here," Isabella whispered. "Don't open this for anyone but me or Adrian. No one else." Margaret nodded. She took Isabella's hand for 1 second and held it, the grip of a woman who had already survived more than the people around her understood. Then Isabella turned back. She moved through the passage in the opposite direction, emerging into the main east hallway, just as 2 men in dark clothing reached the landing. They stopped. They had not expected anyone to be standing in their path. She threw the ceramic vase from the hallway table against the far wall. It shattered with the violence of a gunshot. She ran, not toward the exit but through the house, deeper in, using every narrow corridor and swinging door she knew, forcing them to follow her on terrain she understood, and they didn't. She pulled open kitchen drawers and shoved them across the floor. She knocked over chairs. She turned the house against them. She was buying time. She was not winning, she knew that. She was making noise, creating chaos, keeping them moving instead of searching. She was cornered at the kitchen island when the main doors opened. Adrian came through first. His face was unreadable marble. Behind him, Dominic. His hands in his pockets, his expression composed into something that looked like concern and was absolutely not. The 2 men in the kitchen froze. They looked at Dominic with a question in their eyes that they didn't know Adrian could read from across the room. Dominic looked at Isabella. The composed expression slipped, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and what showed underneath it was not surprise but calculation. The maid is still breathing, and now Adrian has seen the men, and the geometry of this is becoming a problem. Adrian saw all of it. He looked at Dominic for a long, hollow moment. Then he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a chess player who has just watched his opponent make the move he was waiting for. "Take them downstairs," Adrian said softly. Dominic's face smoothed back into its mask. He thought he was winning. He thought the men would be quietly handled, and the problem would disappear and Adrian's trust would seal the door. He had not yet understood that the game had ended hours ago. What Dominic did not know, what Isabella did not know, was that Adrian had spent the 12 hours since the photograph study pulling every thread. He had called his attorney at midnight. He had given instructions that, if he did not call before dawn, were to be executed without waiting for confirmation. He had put everything in motion before sitting down to dinner. He had only been waiting for Dominic to show his hand completely. The dining room held 2 men, 1 candle, and 22 years of a friendship that had never been what it appeared. Adrian poured the wine. His hand was steady. Dominic sat opposite him. He was restless, his eyes moving to the hallway, to the windows, to the doors. He had expected the maid to be gone. The silence from downstairs troubled him. "You seem tense," Adrian said. Dominic looked at him. He had known Adrian long enough to know when the mask was up. He made a decision. "The maid needs to go," Dominic said. "Tonight. I know you feel something, don't? She got lucky with the photograph. She's still a liability. She's been inside this house for 6 weeks, and she knows our—" "Tell me about the cavern ambush," Adrian said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Dominic went still. "My father," Adrian continued, his voice quiet and even. "The location was never formally traced. The investigation closed cold. You ran the investigation." He looked at Dominic. "I never asked you why. I trusted you. I didn't ask." The silence stretched. "I spent 10 years building walls," Adrian said. "I was certain the threat was external. I was certain it was women, Elena, the betrayal, the pattern I was sure I'd identified." He picked up his glass. He didn't drink. "I was looking in exactly the direction you needed me to look." Dominic leaned forward slowly. The mask was gone. What replaced it was something older and harder. "You have nothing," Dominic said. "I have everything," Adrian replied. He reached into his jacket and placed a small silver flash drive on the center of the tablecloth. He set it down gently, without drama, the way you set down something that has already done its work. 5 years of your communications with the Vane Syndicate," Adrian said. "Every wire transfer, every offshore account. The original payment for the cavern tip, routed through 3 shells that took my accountants 14 hours to trace, and will take investigators approximately half that." He looked at Dominic calmly. "It has been with my lawyers since 6 o'clock this evening." Dominic's face emptied. He reached for the drive. Adrian placed his palm over it. He didn't press down hard. He didn't need to. "They have instructions," Adrian said. "If I don't call before dawn, the package goes to the Financial Crimes Unit, the federal prosecutor's office, and 3 journalists I have spent years cultivating precisely for moments like this." He met Dominic's eyes. "Your offshore accounts were frozen at 9 p.m. I imagine you noticed." Dominic sat back. The sound that came from him wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite a breath. From outside, rising through the quiet of the estate grounds, came the distant sound of sirens growing steadily closer. Dominic looked at the doors, then at the flash drive, then at Adrian. "We were brothers," Dominic said. "No," Adrian said simply. "I thought we were." The front doors of the estate opened wide. Officers moved through the foyer in a clean, quiet line. No shouting, no drawn weapons, just the steady, inevitable forward motion of consequence. Dominic stood at the dining room table and watched them come. His shoulders dropped, not in surrender exactly, but in the particular deflation of a man who has been carrying the weight of a long deception and has suddenly, all at once, put it down. He was looking at Adrian when the dining room door opened again. Margaret walked in. She had Isabella's arm and she moved slowly, but her posture was the posture of a woman who had decided the moment she heard the sirens that she was going to be present for this. She was still wearing the robe she'd had on in the linen room. Her hair was unpinned. She looked like herself, unperformed, unhidden, exactly as she was. She walked to the center of the room. She stopped in front of Dominic. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I knew it was you," Margaret said. Her voice was thin, but it did not waver. "Not recently. For years." I saw the way you looked at my son. I saw the way you looked at this house. She tilted her head slightly. I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept thinking, he's been here so long, he must love something here genuinely. She paused. I think you loved the idea of it, just never the reality. Dominic said nothing. He looked older than he had 5 minutes ago. The officers moved forward. They were quiet and efficient. Dominic let them take his arms without resistance. He was a man who had just watched 22 years of careful construction come apart in a single evening, and he did not have the energy left to argue with the mechanics of it. As they led him through the door, he did not look back. Adrian's legal team entered behind the officers. The merger papers were already prepared. The final signature, held pending resolution of the internal security matter that Adrian had flagged 6 weeks ago, quietly to the Financial Oversight Board, was now clear to proceed. Adrian sat at the head of the table and signed. His hand did not shake. The Voss-Kepler merger closed at 4:48 a.m. The Volkov name was, as of that moment, legitimately, irrevocably clean. The last thread connecting it to the underworld had just been let out of the building in handcuffs. The legal team left. The officers left. The house returned to its particular quiet. Adrian walked out to the garden as the sky began to change, the black thinning to a deep, bruised blue, the first gray light pressing up from behind the treeline. Isabella was already there. She was sitting on the stone bench with Margaret's head resting gently on her shoulder. Margaret's eyes were closed. Her breathing was the slow, peaceful rhythm of someone who had finally, after a very long night, let themselves rest. Isabella looked up when she heard his footsteps on the path. He sat on the grass near the bench, not beside her, not at a careful distance, just where the ground was, and his legs decided to stop. He leaned back against the bench leg. He looked at the sky. She wouldn't go back to bed, Isabella said quietly. She never does when something's been resolved, Adrian said. She likes to witness the end. They sat in silence. Not the loaded silence of people who don't know what to say. The quieter kind, of people who have said enough and know it, and are content to let the morning come. After a long time, without looking at him, Isabella said, "You sat at my bedside all night." "You were the only person in that room who did something real," Adrian said. "I needed to know why. I told you. I don't know why. I just moved." "I know," Adrian said. "That's why." He looked at his hands resting on the grass. He thought about the rule he had carried for 10 years, the wall, the distance, the discipline of distrust. He thought about the damage it had not protected him from. He thought about the damage it had done. "I blamed the wrong person for a long time," he said. Isabella didn't ask who. She just nodded. The sky went from gray to pale gold. A bird somewhere in the rose garden started up. Margaret stirred on Isabella's shoulder. She opened her eyes, looked at the light coming over the treeline, and said, with complete satisfaction, "There it is." 1 year later, the estate held a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of tension or surveillance, or a house full of people watching each other from the corners of their eyes. This was the quiet of somewhere that had finally settled into what it was supposed to be. Margaret spent her mornings in the garden with Isabella, pressing late summer roses into the pages of books she collected, but no longer always finished. Her memory had begun to soften at the edges. Some mornings she was fully present, sharp and funny, reciting lines of Yeats from 60 years ago. Other mornings she was somewhere else, somewhere gentle, and Isabella would simply sit beside her and not require her to be anywhere in particular. There was grace in it. Isabella had learned that. Not every hard thing ends. Some things you simply learn to hold differently. Lucia visited on Sundays. The baby, a girl named Sophia, who had entered the world during the worst months of her family's life and seemed determined to treat every moment since as evidence that it had been worth it, was walking now. Badly, triumphantly, with the complete conviction of someone who has just discovered the best thing that has ever happened to anyone. Adrian watched all of it. He had spent a decade as the most feared man in Eastern Europe and had been alone in every room he ever entered. He had called it strength. He understood now that it was something much smaller dressed in a large coat. He never made a declaration. He never sat Isabella down for a formal conversation. There was no moment, exactly. It was more that one day the distance between them had closed without either of them deciding to close it. The way seasons change, gradually and then all at once. He trusted her. Not blindly, not without the careful attention he applied to everything, but genuinely. The way you trust a thing that has proven itself not once but daily, quietly, in the small accumulated weight of ordinary choices made well. She trusted him with less certainty and more honesty, which he preferred. She told him when he was wrong. He had stopped needing to be right all the time. It was, he thought, an equitable arrangement. The rule he had built his life around was not exactly gone. It had been replaced by something more accurate, a truth he had arrived at the long way, through the kind of evidence that can't be argued with. Some people, given the chance to turn away, don't. He had watched her prove it in a ballroom with a tray in her hands. He had watched her prove it in a dark hallway with no weapon. He had watched her prove it every morning in a garden with a woman whose memory was slowly becoming something different from what it had been. He stopped looking for the knife in the dark. He had finally learned, at great cost and considerable delay, that the only things worth protecting were the ones that were already protecting you back.